The empire was vast, stretching from the frozen mountains in the north to the warm coasts in the south. A realm bound together by roads, armies, and a fragile sense of order. On the surface, it seemed unshakable. Markets bustled with trade. Temples rang with prayers, and the banners of the imperial crest fluttered proudly above every city gate. Yet beneath this proud display, cracks had begun to form. In distant provinces, famine stirred unrest. Farmers, weary of sending grain to the capital while their own children starved, whispered of rebellion. Merchants complained of crushing taxes, and scholars spoke carefully of corruption in the emperor's court. Even in the great capital itself, where lanterns lit the grand avenues and soldiers patrolled the marble streets, people carried a quiet unease in their eyes. The court was no less troubled. Alliances among nobles were built not on loyalty but on suspicion and convenience, shifting like sand in the wind. Spies moved through corridors with silent steps, carrying secrets more dangerous than blades. To question the empire's stability aloud was treason, but to ignore the unease in the air was folly. Everyone felt it, though few dared speak it. The empire was standing on the edge of something it could neither predict nor control. The emperor, though draped in gold and power, was haunted. Whispers of betrayal reached him even in his private chambers. Dreams came to him, restless and dark visions of silence, of fire, of a night when voices would be stilled forever. The seers and prophets who dared approach the throne spoke in riddles. Beware the hour when even the birds cease to sing. And so, as the sun dipped behind the horizon on that fateful evening, the empire lay restless. The streets grew quiet, torches flickered against the night wind. And above the walls of the capital, the stars watched in silence. No one could know that within hours, a single night of silence would alter the fate of millions, and history itself would never be the same. Inside the grand palace, where marble columns rose like frozen trees and golden lamps cast trembling shadows, whispers held more power than swords. The court was a stage of elegance and deception. Its actors cloaked in silk, but armed with secrets sharper than steel. Every noble carried two faces, one for the emperor, polished with loyalty, and another hidden beneath, etched with ambition. Behind jeweled smiles lay dangerous intentions. Words spoken aloud were carefully measured, while true thoughts passed only in hushed tones between trusted allies or treacherous conspirators. The great hall, once a place of triumph and ceremony, had become a theater of suspicion. A cough at the wrong time, a glance that lingered too long, could spark rumors that spread faster than fire in dry fields. Courtiers learned to bow with grace while listening for footsteps in the dark, fearing that even their servants might be spies. The emperor's council, too, was fractured. Generals argued over distant wars, each convinced of his own glory. Advisors weighed policies, not for the good of the people, but for the profit of their families. And within the walls of the palace itself, secret alliances twisted tighter with every passing day at night. When the great doors of the throne room closed and the echoes of the day faded, the palace was not silent. It lived with murmurs maids whispering behind tapestries, guards exchanging warnings at shadowed corners, scribes passing folded notes under candlelight. The empire's destiny was being decided not by battles in the fields, but by voices lowered to barely more than breath. And somewhere, in that sea of deceit, a few whispers spoke of something darker still. Not of taxes, not of policies, not even of succession. They spoke of a silent night that would sweep through the palace like a shadow no dawn could chase away. The imperial crown was forged in gold and precious stones, but to the one who wore it, it weighed heavier than iron. Upon the emperor's brow it rested, a symbol of power admired by millions. Yet in his heart it was a burden that pressed deeper with every passing day. Ruling an empire so vast was not a triumph, it was a torment. Each decision rippled across provinces like a stone cast into water, and each ripple brought both loyalty and rebellion. Raise taxes to feed armies, and farmers starved. Grant mercy to a province, and generals raged. The throne was not a seat of rest, but a battlefield where choices could never please all, and where trust was rarer than rubies. In private chambers, away from the eyes of his court, the emperor sometimes lingered before the mirror. He studied his own reflection, the lines of fatigue etched into his face, the shadows beneath his eyes, the silent question written in his features. Was he the master of this empire, or its prisoner? The crown, gleaming on its pedestal when not in use, seemed to mock him. It promised greatness, yet demanded sacrifice. The empire adored the idea of the crown, but despised the man who bore it. For he could never give enough, never rule gently enough, never satisfy the hunger of those who lived beneath his rule. Outside, songs and poems praised his glory. Inside, in the quiet recesses of his mind, he heard only warnings, betrayal, treachery, silence. The very crown that was meant to guard the empire now felt like a beacon, drawing daggers ever closer. It was said in hushed tones by servants and advisers alike that the emperor had grown restless at night, pacing through the palace halls long after the torches had dimmed. Perhaps he feared what was coming. Perhaps he already knew that his crown was not a gift of fortune, but a curse of destiny. And so, even before the silent night arrived, the emperor's spirit was already heavy. He carried not only the empire's fate upon his shoulders, but the gnawing certainty that power never protected, only painted a larger target. The empire was a land of opposites. To a traveler crossing its endless roads, it seemed like two worlds stitched uneasily together. In the great capital, marble towers glistened in the sunlight, markets overflowed with silks and spices, and fountains poured water into the hands of laughing children. Poets recited verses in candlelit halls, and musicians played songs that echoed through moonlit courtyards. To the wealthy and the noble, life appeared timeless, golden, and secure. But far beyond the polished gates, a different empire stirred. Villagers suffered under failing harvests, fields lay cracked and dry, and mothers whispered lullabies to children who went to sleep hungry. Roads that carried riches to the capital also carried soldiers who demanded tribute and grain, leaving the poor with little more than scraps. For every palace feast, there was a family with empty bowls. This contradiction was no secret. Merchants who traveled from province to province carried more than goods. They carried stories. In one city, wealth was measured by the height of its temples. In another, families tore apart their homes just to keep a fire burning through winter. To the empire's rulers, this imbalance was a sign of strength, proof of how much could be taken, commanded, and controlled. But to those who lived at the bottom, it was a sign of decay. Some whispered that such division could not last, that an empire built on extremes of plenty and poverty was like a great wall already cracked at its base. The emperor's advisors ignored such warnings, choosing instead to celebrate victories, host festivals, and write decrees filled with promises that few believed. The empire thrived, and yet it suffered. It expanded, and yet it crumbled. It glittered in the sunlight, and yet groaned in the shadows. And as night crept closer, those contradictions became fuel for the storm that no one rich or poor, noble or peasant would escape. Every empire carries within it enemies more dangerous than those who march at its borders. They are not armies dressed in steel, but shadows dressed in silence. Within the empires, cities, and towns, discontent was not only whispered among peasants and merchants, it lived in the hearts of nobles who smiled at the emperor by day but dreamed of his downfall by night. Some sought revenge for old betrayals. Others sought power that had been denied to them. And still more believed that only through chaos could the empire be reborn in the capital. Secret gatherings flickered in the candlelight of hidden chambers. Their hushed voices spoke of treason. Maps were unrolled, names written down, oaths sworn in whispers. Daggers and coins exchanged hand symbols of loyalty to causes. No one dared speak aloud in the open. Farther away, in provinces governed by proud families, old grudges stirred. Generals commanded their armies with more loyalty to their own lineage than to the emperor's throne. They bided their time, waiting for the empire to stumble so they could claim a larger piece for themselves. And yet, perhaps the greatest danger came not from generals or rival nobles, but from those closest to the crown. Trusted advisors who bent their knee by day only to bend their hearts elsewhere by night. Guards who watched the palace gates, but whose eyes shifted toward darker loyalties. Servants who carried messages in folded parchment, messages that dripped with venom. The emperor suspected as much. It was said, he once remarked, "It is not the enemy who marches openly against me that I fear. It is the hand that pours my wine." These silent enemies thrived in the empire's contradictions, feeding on discontent and waiting for a moment when silence itself would become their weapon. Their patience was long, their shadows deep, and on a night soon to come, they would prove that an empire does not always fall to an army, it can also fall to a whisper. Long before the silent night arrived, voices had already tried to warn of its coming. But these voices did not speak in commands or decrees. They spoke in riddles, in visions, in dreams. In the empire, prophecy was both feared and revered. Seers, wrapped in robes marked with ancient symbols, claimed to glimpse threads of destiny where ordinary eyes saw only shadows. Their words were never direct, never plain. Instead, they were puzzles, spoken in phrases that both comforted and unsettled. One such prophecy had begun to circle through the empire. It was whispered in markets, repeated in taverns, and carried by travelers from one city to another. Beware the night when even the birds fall silent. To many, it was nothing more than a curious phrase, a superstition to be dismissed. But to those close to power, it carried a weight that could not be ignored. The emperor himself summoned prophets to the palace. Some told him of victory and triumph, speaking what they knew he wished to hear. But a few dared to speak the darker vision, that silence, not sound, would mark the empire's greatest turning point. They described a night when voices would be stilled, when secrets would drown out shouts, and when history would be rewritten in whispers rather than in battle cries. The court scoffed, of course. Nobles laughed at such riddles, dismissing them as the fantasies of madmen. Yet in the private hours, when the halls grew quiet and the emperor's crown weighed heavily upon his head, those words haunted him, for prophecy was not a warning that could be denied, that was a shadow that followed, whether believed or not. And in an empire already trembling with contradictions, the language of prophecy spread like smoke, seeping into every corner, reminding all who heard it that something inevitable was drawing near. Every empire has its spies. Some work for gold, others for power, and a few for nothing more than survival. In this empire, their presence was everywhere, hidden in shadows, listening where they should not, watching what others thought unseen. The palace was their greatest hunting ground. Guards at the gates were not only protectors, many carried secret loyalties, slipping information to noble houses that paid well in silver. Servants, moving silently through marble halls, overheard words never meant for their ears and sold them in whispers to the highest bidder. Even scribes, their hands stained with ink, copied not only decrees but secret letters, passing them into the web of silent watchers. Beyond the palace walls, the streets too had eyes. Tavern keepers memorized the faces of travelers. Stable boys listened when soldiers drank too much and spoke too freely. Messengers carried more than letters. They carried truths, lies, and sometimes both at once. The emperor's advisors believed they controlled this invisible network, that every whisper eventually reached the throne. But they were wrong. For every spy loyal to the crown, there were two more who served another master. And in the darkness of the empire, those masters were plotting. The watchers in the dark were patient. They waited, listening, piecing together fragments of information like a puzzle only they could see. They heard of famine, of angry generals, of nobles who grew restless with the emperor's rule. They heard of secret alliances forged with handshakes in candlelit rooms. And most of all, they heard the growing hum of prophecy that silence itself would bring change. The emperor believed his guards kept him safe. The truth was far more fragile. He was surrounded not by protectors, but by watchers' eyes that never closed, ears that never rested, and hearts that did not beat for him alone. And when the silent night came, these watchers would not raise an alarm. They would simply observe and ensure that the silence was absolute. The empire was not held together by strength alone. It was bound by fragile agreements, like threads stretched tight, threatening to snap at the slightest pull. For years, treaties had kept restless neighbors at bay. One border was secured by marriage, another by trade, and still another by bribes hidden beneath the veil of diplomacy. But such peace was never born of trust. It was a balance of fear, where each side waited for the other to falter. Inside the empire, the same fragile cords tied together noble houses. Rival families swore loyalty to the throne, yet their oaths rang hollow. Behind grand feasts and polite words, envy simmered. Alliances shifted quietly, like shadows moving across a wall. Those who toasted the emperor at night often cursed his name by morning. Even the generals of the empire's armies, men whose loyalty should have been unshakable, were divided. Some dreamed of carving their own kingdoms out of the provinces they commanded. Others believed the emperor's rule had weakened the empire, and only steel could restore its glory. To them, peace was not salvation, it was an insult. The common people sensed it too. In crowded marketplaces and along dusty village roads, there was a tension in the air, a sense that the empire's great weight pressed down too heavily to remain balanced. They spoke of storms, of cracks in the foundation, of the day when peace would break like glass against stone. And yet, for all its fragility, the empire clung to the illusion of stability. Festivals were held, banners raised, and proclamations read aloud to assure the people that all was well. But the truth was far more delicate. Peace was not a fortress, was a candle flickering in the wind. All it would take was one night, one moment of silence, for the flame to go out forever. While the nobles schemed in polished halls, the true pulse of the empire beat in the crowded streets and the quiet villages. And that pulse had grown restless. The farmers, who bent their backs beneath the sun, sent grain to the capital only to watch their own families go hungry. Each year the taxes rose higher, and each year the fields grew thinner. To them, the emperor was not a protector, but a distant shadow unseen, untouched, an uncaring dot. In the towns, merchants grumbled. Their wagons creaked under the weight of goods, but the coins they earned vanished into the hands of tax collectors before they could feed their own children. They whispered that the empire no longer rewarded honest work, it only rewarded loyalty to the powerful. Even the soldiers, once proud defenders of the realm, grew bitter. Promises of payment went unfulfilled, and wounded veterans limped home with nothing but scars. Their loyalty to the emperor weakened, replaced by loyalty to whichever lord or general offered them bread and coin. In taverns, songs once filled with pride now carried darker verses. Travelers spoke of famine in one province, rebellion in another. Mothers hushed their children with bedtime stories, not of heroes, but of tyrants, warning them never to trust those who wore crowns. This discontent was not yet open rebellion. It was something quieter, something more dangerous, slow erosion of faith. An empire may survive wars, droughts, even plagues. But when its people stop believing, when hope turns to anger and respect becomes resentment, no crown can hold it together. And so, beneath the glitter of the capital's towers, the empire's foundation crumbled. The people no longer waited for change from their emperor. They began to wait for change from the shadows. The night before it happened, nothing seemed unusual. The capital city moved through its routines as it always had. Merchants shuttered their stalls. Guards lit the torches along the walls, and families gathered in their homes as the last rays of sunlight disappeared. The streets grew quieter with each passing hour. Lanterns flickered in narrow alleys, their glow softened by drifting smoke from the bakeries. Somewhere a lute played a final song before fading into silence. Dogs barked, then fell still. Even the air seemed heavy, as though the city itself understood something was coming. Inside the palace, the mood was no different. Servants whispered their final words before retreating into shadowed quarters. Guards shifted at their posts, their armor clinking softly in the silence. Nobles retired to their chambers, unaware, perhaps unwilling to imagine that this night would not end like the ones before it. And yet, there were signs, subtle but undeniable. Horses grew restless in their stables. A sudden chill passed through the torchlit halls. Some claimed that even the birds fell quiet, as though nature itself recoiled from what was about to unfold. The emperor paced his chambers, unable to rest. He felt the weight of his crown without wearing it, the echo of prophecy without hearing it spoken. Perhaps he sensed it this fragile moment before everything would change. Perhaps he knew that the silence of the city was not peace, but warning. Beyond the walls, the stars glimmered coldly above. They had watched empires rise, and they had watched empires fall. Now they watched again, unblinking. As the empire drifted into the final calm of its long night, it was the last breath before history turned. The storm was waiting, and silence would be its herald. The city slept. The palace stood still. Midnight crept closer, minute by minute, like a shadow stretching across the earth. From the high towers of the capital, the streets below looked peaceful. Torches burned faintly along the walls, and the last whispers of laughter had faded from the taverns. Doors were bolted, windows shuttered, Families sank into uneasy dreams, never imagining they would awaken to a world forever changed. But in the silence, something stirred. At the palace gates, guards shifted restlessly, their eyes drooped with fatigue, their ears straining against the stillness. A few muttered to themselves, unsettled by the uncanny quiet of the night. It was as though the very air held its breath. Inside the palace halls, shadows deepened. Long corridors glowed with the faint light of dying candles. Tapestries swayed with the night wind snaking through unseen cracks. The marble floors echoed with footsteps that should not have been there. The emperor sat awake, his face half hidden by torchlight. Before him, the crown gleamed, silent on its pedestal. He did not wear it. Perhaps he knew it no longer belonged to him. Perhaps he feared that by placing it upon his head, he was sealing his fate. And then the hour struck. The bells tolled 12 times, their sound rolling over the city like a warning too late to be heeded. After the final echo faded, no sound followed. No dogs barked, no footsteps echoed, no birds called. It was midnight. The night of silence had begun. Beyond the palace walls, where torchlight met darkness, figures moved in silence. They were cloaked, their faces hidden, their steps measured to avoid the crunch of gravel beneath their boots. To the weary guards at the gates, they seemed like nothing more than shadows in the mist. But shadows, when they gather, can become armies. The gate stood tall, iron-bound and formidable, yet strength meant little against betrayal. One guard turned his gaze away for a heartbeat too long. Another loosened his grip on his spear. Somewhere, a purse of coins had already exchanged hands earlier that evening. Loyalty had been bought in, silence secured. The figures drew closer. Their breath fogged faintly in the night air, but no sound escaped their lips. They moved with the precision of those who had rehearsed this moment countless times. Each man knew his place, each woman her role. Together they advanced, invisible to all but the stars. Inside, the city slumbered. The common people had no idea that the heart of their empire was about to be pierced. In the stables, horses stamped nervously, sensing danger the humans did not. In the courtyards, statues of long-dead emperors watched silently, their stone eyes bearing witness to treachery about to unfold. The palace guards still stood at their posts, unaware or perhaps unwilling to see that the night was no longer theirs to command. Some shifted uneasily, hearing faint movements, but brushed it off as wind against stone. Others pretended not to hear at all. And so, the shadows gathered at the gates, waiting for the moment when silence would open the way. The first step toward the fall of an empire had arrived. Inside the palace, the corridors glowed with the dim light of torches. Flames danced uncertainly, their flickers stretching shadows across the marble walls. The silence of midnight wrapped around everything like a shroud. The guards walked their rounds, but their steps were slow, their eyes heavy. To them, the night seemed ordinary, almost dull. They did not see the movements in the distance. They did not notice the torches nearest the gates tremble, as if the fire itself sensed what men could not. Then it happened so small, so simple that no one could call it an invasion. A gate creaked open, just wide enough for one figure to slip through. Then another, and another. The shadows entered the palace grounds like smoke seeping through cracks. They moved quickly, keeping close to the walls where the torchlight did not reach. A few paused, watching the guards from the darkness, but no alarm was raised, no shout disturbed the air. Whether through fear, bribes, or blind exhaustion, the watchers of the night did not see, or chose not to. The torches burned on, their flames twisting as the wind carried whispers down the stone halls. In some chambers, nobles slept in heavy silence, unaware of the danger sliding closer with every passing breath. Servants dreamed of morning duties, not knowing that dawn would bring something entirely different. And in the grand throne room, where the empire's crest gleamed above the empty seat of power, the torches flickered again. Shadows lengthened across the walls, stretching like black hands reaching for the heart of the empire. The silence did not break. The fire did not roar. The torches simply trembled like a warning no one could understand. The shadows were inside, and the night had only just begun. Betrayal rarely announces itself with a shout. More often, it comes quietly in soft footsteps, in the silence between words, in the glance of someone once trusted beyond question. Within the palace, as the shadows slipped inside, one figure broke from the safety of loyalty. The betrayer was no stranger, no faceless intruder. This was someone the emperor had seen countless times, had spoken with, perhaps even trusted with secrets too heavy to share with others. A guard, a servant, an advisor. History would never agree on the name, but all accounts would remember the single, deliberate step that turned loyalty into treason. The betrayer moved with the ease of someone who belonged. No suspicion followed them, no alarm rose. Their hands did not tremble, their eyes did not dart nervously. They carried out their role as naturally as breathing. That was the true power of betrayal. It hides beneath the mask of the familiar. Some say a key changed hands that night, unlocking a door that should have remained sealed. Others say it was the removal of a guard from his post, sent away on a fabricated order. Perhaps it was nothing more than a whispered signal, a glance that told the shadows where to move next. But whatever it was, it happened silently. No blade was drawn, no cry rang out. Just a step. A single act of treachery so small that it went unnoticed in the moment, yet so great that it set the empire's fate into motion. From that step onward, there was no turning back. The betrayal had begun. The silent night was no longer approaching, it was here. While shadows crept through the palace halls, the court slept in gilded chambers, dreaming of power, wealth, and tomorrow's intrigues. They were wrapped in silks, guarded by walls of marble, believing themselves untouchable within the heart of the empire. Some nobles drifted into heavy sleep after feasting late into the night, their goblets of wine still half full on polished tables. Others slept lightly, their minds racing with ambition even in dreams. But none awoke, none stirred. The silence of midnight wrapped their chambers like a veil. The court was unaware that footsteps moved just beyond their doors, that loyal guards had been turned away, that familiar hands now carried daggers, not scrolls. They slumbered in arrogance, secure in the belief that walls and servants could shield them from fate. In one chamber, a young noble clutched a parchment beside his bed, letter of schemes meant for the emperor's council at dawn. He would never deliver it. In another, a lady of the court dreamed of banquets and dances, her laughter echoing faintly in her sleep. By morning, that laughter would be silenced forever. The empire's future lay scattered in those beds. Advisors, generals, heirs, all asleep, all vulnerable. The irony was cruel. These were the same men and women who filled the court with endless words by day debates, arguments, flattery, deceit. Yet on this night, their voices were silent, their final silence. Beyond the doors of their chambers, the shadows gathered, and as the court dreamed in full safety, the empire's destiny slipped quietly from their grasp. The shadows did not rush, they did not roar, they did not strike with the chaos of battle. They moved with patience, with precision, with silence. Steel glimmered faintly in the torchlight as blades slid free from their sheaths. No clashing metal, no battle cries only, the whisper of steel cutting through air. Daggers, short swords, hidden knives, all drawn for a single purpose. The first guard never had the chance to speak. A hand clasped his mouth, a blade pressed against his throat, and in a breath, his watch was ended. His body slumped soundlessly to the floor, the torch he carried still flickering, casting light on nothing but stone. In another corridor, a servant turned a corner and froze. She saw them, the intruders, cloaked and armed. Her lips parted, a scream forming in her throat, but the scream never came. A shadow moved, quick as a striking serpent, and silence claimed her too. Room by room, hall by hall, the palace was swallowed. The invaders advanced like smoke in a burning house, seeping into every chamber, leaving no escape. The silence grew heavier. The palace, once alive with voices, footsteps, and echoes, now seemed to hold its breath. The only sounds were the faintest ones, the scrape of boots on stone, the quiet gasp of a final breath, the muted drip of blood onto marble floors. Silent steel had become the voice of the night, and with every stroke, the empire slipped closer to ruin, unmarked by drums or shouts, but remembered forever in whispers. It happened so quickly, so quietly, that history would remember it, not for the sound of battle, but for the silence in which it began. The first strike was not upon a soldier or a guard. It was upon a man of the court, a voice of counsel, asleep in his chamber. The intruders slipped inside, their blades glinting faintly in the dim torchlight. For a moment, he stirred, perhaps sensing a presence in his dreams. But before his eyes could open fully, silence fell forever. Elsewhere, another chamber door creaked open. A noblewoman awoke to see a shadow at her bedside. She opened her mouth to cry out, but the blade was swifter than her voice. Her last breath escaped into the dark, unheard by anyone but the intruder who took it. Strike after strike followed. The assassins did not rush. They moved like a tide, steady and unstoppable. With each room they entered, another voice of the empire was lost. The court, once so loud with arguments and debates, was falling into an unnatural stillness. The first strike was not just against individuals, it was against the empire itself. For in that moment, the balance of power shifted. The foundations of rule trembled. What began as a single blade in the dark became the unraveling of a kingdom. And still, no alarm was raised. No bells tolled. No horns sounded. The silence held. The first strike had been made, and there would be no turning back. The palace had seen blood before. Wars, rebellions, executions all had left their mark on its marble floors, but never like this. never in such silence. As the intruders spread through the halls, blade after blade struck its mark. There were no screams, no shouts of alarm, only muffled gasps, cut short before they could echo. The silence was so complete that even the dripping of blood onto stone seemed deafening in its own way. In one chamber, a noble awoke just in time to see the dagger that ended him. He tried to cry out, but the sound died in his throat. His blood pooled on silk sheets, staining them crimson beneath the moonlight. In another, a young page stumbled upon the intruders. His eyes widened in horror, but his lips never formed a word. A single strike silenced him before his voice could rise. His body crumpled in a corridor where no footsteps dared to rush for help. Room after room, the story repeated itself. Some tried to resist, reaching for swords or shouting in defiance, but their voices were stolen before they could carry through the air. It was as if the night itself swallowed sound, leaving only the quiet rustle of fabric, the hiss of blades, and the steady, dreadful silence that followed. And so the Empire's lifeblood flowed unseen, unheard. It was not the clash of armies that undid the court, but the chilling absence of noise. A massacre conducted with the patience of shadows. Blood without sound, death without witness. The night was no longer silented, was suffocating. The bells had long since fallen silent. Midnight was past, yet within the palace, time no longer seemed to move in hours or minutes. It moved in breaths, in footsteps, in the spaces between lives lost. The turning of the hour was subtle, but it was felt. The assassins, once cautious, grew bolder. Their blades moved faster, their strides more confident. The first shock of silence had passed. Now the work became routine. One chamber after another, one life after another. The Empire was being undone with methodical precision. The air grew heavy. The torches burned lower, their flames shrinking as if recoiling from what they were forced to illuminate. In the long corridors, shadows lengthened unnaturally, twisting as though eager to hide the deeds being carried out. Somewhere in the palace, the Emperor still lived. He had not yet been reached, yet the balance had already shifted. By this hour, the Empire's heart was bleeding, its voice severed. Even if the Emperor survived until dawn, the world he ruled was already broken. Outside the palace walls, the city slept uneasily. A few dogs barked, then fell silent. A woman awoke suddenly, shivering though no wind entered her home. Perhaps she sensed something amiss. Perhaps the Empire itself was trembling, its spirit echoing through the dreams of its people. The hour had turned. What began as shadows at the gates had now become a storm within the throness' very walls. And the silence, unbroken, relentless, was no longer just a warning. It was the sound of history changing. In every great turning of history, there is always one who sees, one who survives, not by strength or power, but by chance, or perhaps by fate. Amid the silence of that night, as steel claimed life after life, there was one figure who remained hidden. A servant, perhaps, who slipped behind a curtain when the footsteps drew near. A young scribe who crouched beneath his desk, holding his breath. Or a guard too frightened to draw his sword, frozen in the dark. The witness did not cry out, did not run, did not fight. They watched, they listened, they remembered. Through a crack in a door, through the folds of fabric, or from the shadows of a stairwell, they saw the truth unfold. They saw nobles cut down in their sleep, guards silenced before they could raise alarm, torches flickering against marble streaked with blood. They saw the assassins move with calm purpose, as if guided by an invisible hand. But the greatest burden was not what they said, was what they could not say. To cry out would have been to die. To resist would have been to vanish. And so the witness remained silent, their heart pounding louder than any sound that filled the air. History would forget the names of those who died that night, but the memory of the unseen witness endured. For while others perished, it was their eyes that carried the truth forward, hidden in silence until the day it would be spoken, or perhaps never spoken at all. In that moment, the empire still had a heartbeat, but it was faint, trembling, and guarded only by the silent memory of a single survivor. The sun rose slowly over the capital, its pale light spilling across rooftops, temples, and streets. To the people beyond the palace walls, it seemed like any other morning. Merchants opened their stalls, children fetched water, farmers prepared their carts for the markets. The world appeared unchanged. But inside the palace, dawn revealed a different truth. The first rays of light cut through stained windows and fell upon corridors, where shadows no longer moved, but bodies lay still. The silence of the night had ended, yet no sound of life filled those halls. Servants entering for their morning duties froze in terror. Their baskets slipped from their hands, fruit scattering across blood-stained stone. Door after door was opened, chamber after chamber entered, and with each discovery, horror spread. Nobles who had feasted the evening before now lay cold upon their silken beds. Guards who had sworn oaths of loyalty were found slumped against walls, their weapons still sheathed. The great court of the empire, once so loud with debates and ambition, had been reduced to silence eternal. By mid-morning, the news had begun to seep beyond the palace. Whispers raced through the streets faster than merchants could trade. The people spoke of betrayal, of assassins, of omens come true. Some wept, others raged, and some only stared at the palace gates with dread, knowing instinctively that the empire they had known was gone, for dawn had not brought renewal. It had brought revelation. The silent night was no longer just prophecy or rumor, it was history carved in blood. And the empire, though the sun still rose upon it, had entered a darkness from which it could never return. By the time the sun climbed higher, the whispers had grown into a chorus of fear. What began as rumors trickling from servants' lips spread through the marketplaces, taverns, and alleys of the capital. The people did not yet know the details, but they knew enough. The court was gone. The first cries rose from mothers and wives who served within the palace, waiting outside its gates for loved ones who would never emerge. Their wails echoed against the stone walls, carrying grief into the streets. Soon others joined, not with mourning, but with terror. If nobles and generals could be struck down in their sleep, what safety was left for anyone? Merchants abandoned their stalls. Farmers turned their carts back toward the fields. Children clutched at their parents' robes, sensing fear in voices that usually carried certainty. Some shouted that the gods had turned their faces away from the empire. Others swore that rebellion had begun and that soldiers would soon flood the city. A few whispered the prophecy aloud. The night when even the birds fall silent. The words spread like wildfire, burning deeper dread into every heart. The emperor had not spoken. No proclamation had been read. And so, the silence of authority was filled with the noise of panic. The people's trust, already thin as paper, tore apart in the morning light. The cry of the people was more than grief, was the sound of an empire unraveling. Inside the palace walls, dawn revealed more than death, it revealed disorder. Servants stumbled through corridors once polished to gleam, now stained with the crimson memory of the night. Furniture lay overturned, tapestries torn where blades had brushed too close, doors splintered open. The scent of iron clung to the air, heavy and suffocating, refusing to fade even as sunlight poured through shattered windows. The throne room, the proud heart of the empire, stood violated. The great banners hung crooked, their golden embroidery smeared with blood. The emperor's seat remained untouched. Yet it seemed less a throne now, and more an empty relic, powerful in appearance, powerless in truth. Scribes who survived by chance wandered in disbelief, clutching scrolls to their chests as if inked words could shield them from the silence that surrounded them. Guards who found themselves alive by luck, not loyalty, stood frozen, unable to explain how the empire's center had been gutted in a single night. Arguments broke out in hushed tones. Who had opened the gates? Who had dimmed the torches? Who among them was traitor and who was victim? Fingers pointed, but no answers came. Fear, heavier than stone, pressed down on everyone who remained. The palace that once symbolized order, law, and unshakable strength was now reduced to chaos. No voice of command rose to calm the panic. No hand of authority steadied the trembling court. It was a shambles of stone and silence, and in its ruins a question grew louder with every moment of quiet. If the heart of the empire had fallen, what hope remained for the body? When the first shock faded, what remained was suspicion. The survivors inside the palace, scribes, guards, advisors spared by chance, moved through the halls not with grief alone, but with desperate questions. Who had opened the gates? Who had guided the blades? Who had betrayed the empire from within? Searches began at once. Chambers were ransacked, scrolls examined, seals inspected. Bloodied footprints were studied as though they might reveal the names of those who left them behind. Yet the assassins had been careful. They left no banners, no claims, no words scratched upon the walls. Only silence, and silence gave no answers. The emperor demanded names. His surviving counselors bent their heads low, offering theories as quickly as they could form them. Some pointed to rival nobles. Others blamed generals from distant provinces. Still others whispered of foreign powers, jealous of the empire's reach. Each accusation served not truth, but survival. To blame another was to draw suspicion away from oneself. Servants were dragged into questioning. Some swore they had seen cloaked figures. Others denied all knowledge. A few disappeared before dawn's end. Whether silenced by fear or by force, no one could be certain. But the truth was more elusive than anyone dared admit. The night had been too clean, too efficient. This was no riot, no drunken rebellion. It was something colder, something calculated. A plan long prepared, carried out with precision no ordinary uprising could match. And so the hunt began, not just for the killers who had struck, but for the invisible hands that had guided them. For in the empire a single truth now hung above all else. The silent night was not the end of betrayal. It was only its beginning. When truth hides in shadows, lies rush to fill the void. In the days after the silent night, the court, what little of it remained, hungered for answers. The emperor, stricken and enraged, demanded justice. But no proof could be found, and so suspicion became weapon, and accusation became law. The first to fall were the powerless, servants who could not defend themselves, guards who had survived the night, scribes who had copied the wrong orders. All were dragged into questioning. Their pleas echoed through the palace, but their voices meant nothing. To accuse them was easier than to face the greater truth, that betrayal had come from within the very heart of power. Nobles seized the moment to settle their rivalries. One family pointed toward another, calling them traitors. Old debts and jealousies resurfaced, cloaked in the language of loyalty. Those who had once argued about taxes or land now accused one another of conspiring with assassins. Even generals far from the capital were branded guilty. Messages were sent across provinces declaring that this commander or that governor had ordered the slaughter. Some were innocent, but innocence mattered little. The empire needed enemies to punish, and so enemies were created. For every accusation, heads rolled. For every rumor, a life ended. The palace grew no safer, the empire grew no stronger, but the fear deepened, tightening its grip on all who remained. The silent night had stolen voices in sleep. The days that followed stole voices in daylight, voices silenced not by daggers, but by falsehoods, by power, by the desperate need to place blame. And as the innocent were punished, the true traitors vanished deeper into the shadows. Amidst the chaos of blame and punishment, there remained one who had seen the truth, the unseen witness of that night, still alive, still silent. They carried within them the memory of every flicker of torchlight, every shadow that moved, every blade that struck. They had seen the betrayer's step, had heard the silence that followed each fall. Their eyes held what no scroll recorded, what no accusation revealed, yet they did not speak. They could not. To reveal what they knew was to sign their own death. If the traitor still lingered in the palace, a single word from the witness would mark them for silence. If those in power did not wish the truth uncovered, their testimony would be buried along with their body. And so they held their secret close, as one might clutch a dagger hidden beneath a cloak. It weighed on them, heavy and unrelenting. Each day they watched innocents punished for crimes they did not commit. Each night they remembered the faces of those who had fallen in silence. Sometimes, in the stillness before sleep, they wondered if fate had spared them for a reason. Perhaps the truth was meant to survive in their memory until the time was right. Or perhaps it was simply a curse, that they had lived not to escape the night, but to carry it with them forever. The survivor's silence became its own kind of prophecy. One day their secret would matter. One day the empire would learn what truly happened that night, but not yet, not while fear ruled stronger than truth. The silent night had struck down nobles and courtiers, but its true shadow reached further still. In the days that followed, the emperor's loyal protectors, the old guard, found themselves marked not as defenders, but as suspects. These were men and women who had stood beside the throne for decades. Veterans of wars, keepers of tradition, symbols of stability in an empire that trembled with unrest. Their loyalty was unquestioned until the night of silence shattered everything. "Where were you when the blade struck?" the emperor demanded. "Why did your watch falter? Why did you survive when so many did not?" The old guard had no answer strong enough to satisfy grief and rage. Some had been absent from their posts, sworded away by the very traitors who planned the slaughter. Others had been overpowered before they could raise alarm. But excuses meant nothing. To the shaken empire, survival itself was suspicious. One by one, they were accused. One by one, stripped of rank, titles, and honor. Some were imprisoned, others executed in the square before a frightened crowd. Their names, once spoken with pride, became warnings whispered in fear. And so, the empire's shield was broken from within. The generals who might have defended the crown were gone. The advisors who might have steadied the emperor's hand had vanished. The loyal, the seasoned, the trusted swept away not by the assassin's blades, but by suspicion, paranoia, and the desperate hunger for blame. The old guard fell, and with them, the last thread of protection that bound the empire together. The silent night had claimed more than lives it had claimed trust. And without trust, an empire is already lost. When the old guard fell, a vacuum opened at the very heart of power. And vacuums never remain empty for long. Those who had planned the silent night, those who had whispered in secret chambers and moved in shadows, began to emerge into the light. No longer cloaked, no longer silent, they stepped forward as saviors of the empire. They spoke of loyalty. They spoke of restoring order. They spoke of protecting the crown. Yet every word was a mask, concealing the ambition that had guided their hands all along. New faces began to surround the emperor. Advisors he had once trusted were gone executed, exiled, or discredited. In their place stood men and women who owed their sudden rise not to service, but to blood spilled in the night. Generals who had once commanded in obscurity now marched proudly at the emperor's side. Nobles who had been overlooked now claimed titles of honor. The emperor, weary and desperate, clung to them. His grief had hollowed him, his rage had blinded him, and so he reached for anyone who promised stability. He could not see, or would not see, that the very architects of betrayal now guided his hand. In the capital, whispers grew. People began to say that the empire had not lost its way by accident, that the silent night had been more than violence. It had been a doorway, and through that doorway, usurpers had stepped into power. They did not need to seize the throne directly. They did not need to wear the crown themselves. All they needed was to stand close enough to guide it, and to let the emperor believe he still ruled. The rise of the usurpers was quiet, steady, and absolute. An empire had been broken in silence, and now, in silence, it was being reshaped. Fear does not fade when the sun rises. It lingers. It multiplies. It settles into the bones of a people until even whispers feel dangerous. In the aftermath of the silent night, the empire's citizens lived under that fear. They woke in the morning to find the palace changed, their rulers replaced, their protectors gone. But what frightened them most was not the blood spilled, it was the silence that followed. No proclamations explained what had happened. No truth was spoken aloud. Instead, the streets filled with rumors that anyone could be accused, that anyone could vanish, that even speaking too loudly might draw unwanted attention. The empire had become a place where silence was safer than truth. Merchants spoke carefully at their stalls, lowering their voices when customers asked too many questions. Farmers traveling to the city carried their grain but not their opinions. Mothers hushed their children quickly, fearful that careless words might echo where unfriendly ears listened. Even laughter grew rare. Taverns that once rang with song now buzzed only with murmurs. Families gathered around their fires at night, staring into the flames, each afraid to speak of what they feared most, that the silent night was not over, that it could return at any time. The usurpers did not need to raise their swords again. Fear did the work for them. It spread faster than soldiers, more thoroughly than decrees. It silenced resistance before it could form. It made people complicit in their own oppression, keeping their heads bowed, their voices muted. The echo of fear was louder than any cry for justice. And in that echo, the empire's spirit withered quietly away. Empires fall not only in the clash of swords, but in the stories told afterward. And the silent night, though cloaked in secrecy, could not remain hidden forever. At first, the whispers were quiet traders on dusty roads, repeating what they had heard in the capital, servants carrying tales from kitchen to market. But with each telling, the night grew larger, darker, more terrible. Facts blurred into legends, truths tangled with fears. Some said the assassins had been shadows themselves, not men of flesh and bone, that they passed through locked doors as easily as smoke. Others swore that the gods had walked the palace halls that night, punishing the empire for its arrogance. Still others claimed the emperor himself had ordered the slaughter, turning against his own court to cling to power. The truth was lost in the wind. What remained were whispers carried from city to city, village to village, until even the most distant provinces spoke of the night when silence devoured an empire. Mothers wove it into lullabies to hush restless children. Old men retold it at firesides, their voices low, their eyes darting toward shadows. Soldiers muttered it in their camps, half warning, half prayer. Even priests, though cautious, let fragments slip into sermons, reminders that silence could be more deadly than war. The usurpers tried to control the story. They ordered proclamations, punished those who spread rumors, erased names from official records. But stories are wild things. Once released, they cannot be caged. The silent night became more than history. It became legend, a wind that could not be caught, a shadow that could not be burned away. And the empire, though it tried to silence the past, found itself haunted by the whispers of its own undoing. The empire that rose after the silent night was not the same as the one that had fallen asleep before it. Outwardly, the crown still glittered, the throne still stood, the banners still waved, but beneath the surface, everything had changed. The emperor remained, but his authority was hollow. He spoke less often, and when he did, his words sounded rehearsed, guided by the new voices that now surrounded him. His decrees were no longer his own. They were the designs of those who had survived, those who had stepped forward from the shadows. The new order was not announced with trumpets or proclamations. It did not need to be. It was felt. It was understood. The palace walls, once echoing with debate and rivalry, became quiet halls of obedience. Ministers bowed lower than before. Guards marched with sharper precision, their loyalty not to the crown, but to unseen masters who pulled the strings. Every corner of power was occupied, every chamber filled with eyes that watched and ears that reported. Across the empire, the changes spread. Laws grew stricter, taxes heavier, voices fewer. Where once there had been argument and negotiation, there was now silence enforced, demanded, absolute. The people understood quickly. The silent night had not ended with dawn. It lived on in the structure of the new empire. To speak too freely was dangerous. To question openly was fatal. To remain silent was to survive. The new order had risen not from victory, but from silence. And in that silence, an empire continued unchanged in name, but unrecognizable in soul. In the new order, silence was no longer an accident of the night, it became policy. The voices that had once guided the empire's scholars, poets, advisors, generals were gone. Some had perished in their beds. Others had been accused and condemned. A few still lived, but their tongues were bound by fear. Words that once carried weight now carried death. The court, once filled with arguments and competing visions, was reduced to echoes of obedience. Ministers no longer offered counsel. They repeated what was expected, carefully shaping their sentences so no word could be twisted into disloyalty. Every phrase was measured, every breath cautious. Beyond the palace walls, the silencing continued. Scrolls were burned, songs forbidden, plays rewritten. The empire's storytellers learned quickly, speak of glory or do not speak at all. Mothers warned their children not to repeat the things they overheard at home. Tavern keepers hushed conversations when strangers entered. The people learned to whisper less, to say less, until their silence was complete. And in that silence, history itself began to change. The story of the silent night was no longer told as it had been. Official records spoke not of betrayal, but of a necessary cleansing. Scrolls proclaimed that traitors had been purged, that the throne had been saved, that the gods themselves had blessed the emperor's survival. The truth, the blood, the betrayal, the shadows was being buried beneath lies. But silence, even enforced, could not erase memory. Somewhere in the empire, there were still those who remembered, and in their silence they carried the weight of voices the empire had tried to erase. Not all were slain on the silent night. Some were spared, but not to live in honor. They were the exiled, cast out of the capital, stripped of titles, lands, and names. Nobles who had once dined beside the emperor were marched through the city gates in chains. Generals who had once commanded armies were sent into barren provinces with no soldiers to follow them. Scholars whose voices had once filled the court were silenced not by death, but by banishment. For the new order, exile was more useful than execution. The forgotten did not become martyrs. They became ghosts, drifting into obscurity, erased from scrolls, from memory, from history itself. In villages far from the capital, strangers appeared, once lords and ladies, now beggars. They spoke little of who they had been. To do so was dangerous. Instead, they lived in quiet despair, watching the empire they had helped build from a distance, unable to return, unable to resist. Children grew up not knowing their parents' true names. Entire families vanished from records, their coat of arms burned, their stories buried. To the empire, they had never existed. But the exiled carried something the usurpers could not take: memory. They remembered the laughter of the court, before it fell silent. The debates that had once shaped laws, the promises that had been broken. They remembered the silent night not as propaganda, but as it truly had been. And in the shadows of their obscurity, those memories became seeds. Seeds that, one day, might grow again. For the exiled may be forgotten by history, but history is never truly forgotten by the exiled. The silent night had shattered the empire, but in the years that followed, its story was remade not by those who lived it, but by those who wished to control it. Scrolls were rewritten, records altered. The official version of history declared that the slaughter was not betrayal, but deliverance. The empire had been cleansed of traitors who conspired against the throne. The assassins, it was claimed, were agents of order, acting with the blessing of the gods themselves. The truth that the night was treachery born of ambition was erased. In its place stood a carefully polished tale of justice, discipline, and divine approval. Artists were commissioned to paint murals, not of chaos, but of victory. The emperor was depicted with radiant light behind his head, sword raised high, surrounded by loyal subjects who had supposedly protected him in his darkest hour. Songs were composed, praising the night of purification. Priests echoed the story in their sermons, reminding the people that obedience was salvation and silence was safety. Those who remembered differently knew better than to speak. To question the official story was to invite exile, imprisonment, or worse. And so they kept their memories hidden, whispered only in the most trusted of company, or written in secret letters that risked discovery. Over time, even the whispers grew faint. Children learned only the revised tale. A generation was raised to believe the silent night had been a triumph, not a tragedy, and those who carried the truth in their hearts became fewer, their silence forced, their memories fading. History had not been lost, it had been rewritten, and in the rewriting, the empire secured not just obedience, but forgetting. Though the empire's rulers believed they had buried the truth, seeds do not remain hidden forever. Even in silence, rebellion begins to grow. In the taverns of distant provinces, whispers still carried the old story, the story of betrayal, of daggers in the night, of the court destroyed not by justice, but by treachery. Farmers repeated it as warning. Merchants told it as rumor. Soldiers muttered it by the fire when their captains could not hear. Among the exiled, the truth was guarded like a flame cupped against the wind. Families who had lost everything told their children the forbidden version of the silent night, vowing that one day justice would return. Old generals, stripped of command, sketched battle lines in the dirt, waiting for the moment they could strike again. Even within the capital, rebellion stirred quietly. A servant who had seen too much passed messages folded into loaves of bread. A scribe, loyal to memory, not power, copied forbidden records by candlelight. A young noble, spared only by luck, began to gather allies beneath the guise of feasts and celebrations. The empire appeared whole, its laws unchallenged, its rulers secure. But beneath that calm, cracks widened. Every whispered story, every hidden letter, every oath spoken in secret was a seed. And those seeds take time to grow, they never forget the soil in which they were planted. The silent night had birthed fear, but from fear, rebellion began to take root. Years passed, but memories do not fade easily for those who have seen what others cannot imagine. The unseen witness of that night, the one who survived in silence, had lived in the shadows, carrying a burden heavier than any crown. They had watched the empire twist the truth. They had heard the lies spoken from pulpits and scrolls, declaring betrayal as loyalty, treachery as justice. They had stayed quiet, knowing that a single word might cost them their life. But silence, no matter how long, can only last so far. One night, in a quiet gathering of the discontented, the witness spoke, not loudly, not boldly, but with trembling honesty. They told of the step of betrayal, of the blades drawn in silence, of the court cut down in their sleep. They described the shadows that entered the gates, not as divine servants, but as ordinary men, guided by greed and ambition. Those who listened leaned in closer, hearts pounding, for in those words was confirmation of what they had long suspected. The silent night was no victory. It was a crime. From then on, the witness could not return to silence. Their story began to spread, carefully, cautiously, from ear to ear, in letters hidden beneath floorboards, in whispered conversations by firelight, in coded phrases passed between merchants. The truth began to travel again. The usurpers still ruled, but now their greatest fear had returned. Not armies, not open revolt, but memory. For the witness had returned not as a soldier, not as a leader, but as a voice. And a single voice, once silenced, now carried the power to unravel an empire built on lies. History is never still. It is written, erased, and written again. And in the years after the silent night, a quiet war began, not of steel, but of memory. On one side stood the empire, determined to bury the truth. Scribes were ordered to copy only the official version of events. Schools taught children of the night of purification. Murals showed traitors cut down, their faces twisted into shadows, while the emperor stood radiant in divine light. To question this story was to defy the empire itself. On the other side stood those who remembered, survivors who had lost everything, exiles who carried secrets, and the unseen witness who could no longer remain silent. Their weapons were not swords, but whispers, hidden scrolls, songs sung in hushed tones. In some villages, the truth lived in lullabies sung by mothers to their children. In others, it was carved into wood or stone, disguised as decoration. A few dared to keep forbidden manuscripts, rolled tight and hidden beneath floorboards, knowing discovery meant death. The empire hunted these voices. Informants were paid to listen. Guards raided homes at night. Those caught were silenced forever. Yet still the truth endured, because memory has a way of surviving where power cannot reach. It was not a battle fought in fields, but in hearts. Each generation had to choose, believe the story written in scrolls, or the story whispered in shadows. The struggle for memory was endless, and though the empire controlled ink and stone, it could never fully control the human tongue. For truth, once spoken, lingers like an echo that even silence cannot erase. The empire seemed strong. Its banners still hung from the palace walls. Its soldiers still marched in perfect rows. Its markets still bustled with trade. To the casual eye, nothing had changed. The crown gleamed as it always had. But beneath the surface, the facade was crumbling. The emperor's voice had grown thin, his decrees sounding less like command and more like repetition. He was a figure wrapped in ceremony, guided not by his own will, but by the hands of those who had risen in silence. The people saw it, they heard it, and though they did not speak aloud, they knew their ruler was no longer truly their ruler. The usurpers, though powerful, could not escape the shadow of the silent night. Every festival they hosted, every proclamation they made, was met with quiet suspicion. Smiles were given in public, but in private, questions festered. Who truly held the reins of power? How long could lies stand before they collapsed beneath their own weight? Beyond the capital, provinces began to strain. Governors grew restless, soldiers grumbled of unpaid wages, and farmers resisted the crushing taxes. The empire's silence, once a tool of control, became a burden too heavy to carry. Fear could stifle voices, but it could not fill empty stomachs. Even within the palace, cracks widened. Jealousies flared among the very usurpers who had conspired together. Each believed they deserved more than the others. Each wondered whether another silent night might one day turn against them. And so the empire glittered in the sun. But it was a glitter like cracked glass, sharp, fragile, waiting for the moment it would shatter. The facade still stood, but it trembled. The silent night had ended in blood, but its echo never left the palace. Servants whispered that they still saw shadows moving in corridors where no footsteps should fall. Guards swore they heard faint cries in chambers long emptied. Some refused to stand watch near the old court's chambers, claiming the air there was colder, as if the walls themselves remembered. Superstition grew. Every flicker of a torch, every creak of a door, was taken as a sign. Nobles avoided certain rooms entirely, believing them cursed by the spirits of those slain in silence. A few claimed that the ghosts of the fallen appeared in their dreams, faces pale, eyes accusing, lips sealed by silence they could never break. The emperor himself grew restless. He wandered the palace at night, his eyes hollow, his ears straining as though listening for voices only he could hear. Some nights he claimed to see figures in his chamber, vanishing before he could speak. Other nights he woke screaming, clutching the crown as if it might protect him from the dead. The usurpers dismissed these fears in public, but in private they too shuddered. They avoided speaking of the silent night, as though naming it aloud might summon its shadow once more. Even they, who had orchestrated the slaughter, began to fear what they could not control. Memory turned into myth, myth turned into haunting. The palace, once a symbol of authority, had become a tomb of silence. Its halls glittered with marble and gold, but beneath the splendor, the court lived with the weight of unseen eyes. The silent night had not only taken lives, it had left ghosts, and those ghosts, whether real or imagined, haunted the court with every breath. No empire can escape its own history. The silent night lingered not only as memory, not only as rumor, but as a shadow that guided every decision made within the palace walls. The emperor, weakened by fear and haunted by dreams, hesitated in his rule. Each decree was measured against the memory of betrayal. Each treaty, each alliance, each judgment carried the weight of suspicion. Trust, once the lifeblood of governance, had withered. Now every face was a potential enemy, every word a hidden threat. The usurpers, though they claimed victory, lived beneath the same shadow. They remembered the silence they had created, and they feared it might return this time against them. They tightened their grip on the empire, issuing harsher laws, watching more closely, silencing more quickly. The stronger they tried to appear, the more brittle they became. In the provinces, the shadows stretched long. Governors ruled with fear rather than respect, invoking the silent night as warning, speak against the throne, and you too will vanish in silence. For some, this kept rebellion at bay. For others, it fed the flames of quiet defiance. Even the people, who had no part in the palace intrigues, felt the shadow. They lived in the silence of markets that no longer buzzed freely, in festivals stripped of laughter, in lullabies sung more softly, as though joy itself was dangerous. The silent night was not a single event. It was a wound that never healed, a shadow that spread across years, shaping choices, shaping fear, shaping the very soul of the empire. And though the empire still stood, it no longer walked in sunlight. It moved beneath the shadow of its own past. Time passed, rulers changed, new banners rose, provinces shifted hands. Yet the silent night never faded. It lingered not in official scrolls, but in memory, in story, in the hushed voices of those who refused to forget. Parents told their children of it, warning them never to trust too easily, never to believe the empire's silence was safety. Grandparents whispered the tale by firelight, lowering their voices when the wind rattled the shutters. The details changed with each telling. Sometimes the assassins were shadows. Sometimes they were soldiers. Sometimes they were traitors from within the court. But the heart of the story never changed. A night of silence had ended an empire. Generations grew up beneath this echo. Some accepted the official story taught in schools, that it had been a night of justice. But many, in secret, carried the older version, the forbidden one, that it had been betrayal, and that silence itself was the weapon. The echo of the silent night shaped lives long after the blood had dried. Young soldiers hesitated to serve lords too ambitious. Poets filled their verses with metaphors of shadows and silence. Even rulers feared it. Each emperor after that night carried the weight of its memory, knowing that crowns do not protect against betrayal in the dark. And so, the silent night lived on, not as a single event, but as a warning passed from mouth to mouth, from heart to heart, from one generation to the next. It was no longer just history. It had become legend, and legends, once born, never truly die. The silent night did not only change rulers and courts, it changed the way an entire empire understood power. For some, the lesson was clear. Silence is strength. They believed that to rule was to control words, to smother dissent before it could take form. Silence became a weapon sharper than steel. It was taught in the palace schools, preached in temples, enforced in markets. A quiet empire, they said, was a safe empire. But others drew a different lesson. They saw that silence was not protection, it was danger. For it was silence that had allowed the assassins to creep through halls unchallenged. Silence that had smothered cries for help. Silence that had left the empire blind until it was too late. To them, the silent night was a warning. When people do not speak, when fear mutes voices, betrayal thrives. The nobles remembered it as fear. The people remembered it as injustice. And the exiles remembered it as loss. Each group carried their own lesson, and together those lessons shaped the empire's soul. Generations later, leaders still invoked it. Some used the silent night as an excuse to demand obedience, reminding the people what happens when loyalty falters. Others used it as a warning against tyranny, urging their followers never to let silence choke out truth again. The lessons were many, but they were never forgotten. And that was the true legacy of the silent night, not only in what it destroyed, but in what it taught. That silence is never neutral. It is either protection or betrayal. Every empire carries two histories, the one that was and the one that might have been. The silent night carved a wound into time. It stole futures that would never come to pass. In the hours before the blade struck, the empire still had promise. Advisors were preparing new reforms. Generals were planning campaigns to expand the borders. Scholars were drafting laws meant to bring fairness to the provinces. Within the court slept possibilities that, by dawn, had vanished forever. What might have been an empire of learning became an empire of fear. What might have been a golden age of prosperity became an age of silence. The poets who would have written verses to inspire generations instead left unfinished lines, stained in blood. The statesmen who might have guided the empire to stability instead became forgotten names, erased from scrolls. Even the people felt the loss, though they could not always name it. They sensed it in the empty festivals, in the hollow proclamations, in the way laughter seemed rarer after that night. It was as though joy itself had been stolen alongside the lives of the court. And so, history recorded only what happened. But in the shadows of memory lived the empire that never was, the empire that might have risen had silence not fallen. It is perhaps the cruelest truth of all, that the greatest tragedies are not only in what is destroyed, but in what is never allowed to be. Though the empire tried to bury the silent night in silence, memory found other ways to endure, not in scrolls, not in decrees, but in song. The survivors, those who lived through the terror, those who lost family, those who carried grief too heavy for words, began to weave their sorrow into verses. At first, the songs were little more than whispers, lullabies sung by mothers to restless children, prayers murmured in the dark. But soon they spread, slipping beyond walls and borders, carried on the tongues of travelers and wanderers. The words were careful. They never named the emperor, never spoke of the usurpers. Instead, they spoke in symbols, the night when birds fell silent, the torch that flickered but gave no light, the crown that wept alone. Each line was a truth hidden in poetry, too subtle for censors to erase, too powerful for time to silence. Musicians turned the story into ballads, played softly in taverns. Poets etched it into their verses, disguising it as myth. Even painters, forbidden to depict the slaughter, painted shadows and empty chairs images that carried meaning for those who knew how to see. For the survivors, these songs were more than memory. They were resistance, a way to keep the truth alive, even when voices were threatened, even when scrolls were burned. Generations later, the songs still lingered. Some had changed form, becoming folk tales or riddles. Others survived almost unchanged, sung softly by firesides. Each time, the silent night was reborn not in history books, but in the hearts of those who sang. And so, silence was answered with song. And song, carried forward, became the empire's true memory. Centuries passed, and the empire changed faces, rulers, and names. Yet the silent night never vanished completely. It lingered in whispers, in songs, in fragments of rumor. And then, one day, pieces of the truth emerged again, not in legend, but in ink and stone. In a forgotten chamber beneath the palace, hidden scrolls were uncovered. They were not the polished records of the court, but secret writing scribes who had dared to write what they had truly seen. Margins filled with hurried notes, stained with candle wax, spoke of betrayal, of a gate unlocked, of nobles slain before they could rise. Elsewhere, in a monastery far from the capital, a faded manuscript surfaced. Its verses described the night in veiled language, yet too precise to be myth. The monks who preserved it had known its danger, but they had copied it again and again in secret, ensuring its survival. Archaeologists unearthed broken artifacts, blades marked with unfamiliar symbols, shattered seals belonging to families erased from history, fragments of murals hastily covered with paint. Each piece was a clue, a fragment of the night the empire had tried to erase. The discovery spread, scholars debated, some clung to the official version, unwilling to believe their history had been built on lies. Others embraced the revelations, piecing together a narrative far closer to what had truly happened. For the first time in generations, the silent night was no longer only myth or memory. It stood revealed, fragile but undeniable, as truth. And truth, once unearthed, cannot be buried again. When the hidden records surfaced, they did not end the mystery of the silent night. They deepened it. For centuries, the people had lived with the legend. Assassins who moved like shadows, divine punishment from the gods, a court silenced by fate itself. Songs, poems, and stories had shaped a silent night into something larger than life. To strip away the myth was to strip away identity, memory, belief. And yet, the unearthed truths painted a different picture. They spoke not of gods, but of men, not of fate, but of betrayal. A night born not from heaven's will, but from ambition, greed, and human weakness. The people were divided. Some clung fiercely to the myth, refusing to believe their ancestors had been victims of treachery rather than destiny. To them, the silent night was sacred, a story that explained suffering, warned against arrogance, and gave divine meaning to loss. Others embraced the reality, no matter how bitter. They argued that to understand the empire's fall, one must face the truth, that silence had been orchestrated, not bestowed, that an empire had been undone not by gods, but by those who claimed to serve it. Myth gave comfort, reality gave clarity, and between them stretched a chasm the empire could not bridge. Perhaps the truth was both. Perhaps the silent night was more than betrayal, more than legend. Perhaps it was both, at once, forever woven together. But in the end, it no longer mattered whether people believed the myth or the reality, for both told the same lesson, that silence can destroy, and that empires fall not only by the sword, but by the shadows within. Centuries after the silent night, long after its blood had dried and its rulers had turned to dust, thinkers and scholars still wrestled with its meaning. Some called it a tragedy of power, a reminder that empires collapse not from enemies at their borders, but from betrayals in their own halls. Others saw it as justice, a reckoning upon a court bloated with greed arrogance, and decay. Still others argued it was simply inevitable, the natural turning of history, where silence was not cause, but consequence. Philosophers debated whether silence was strength or weakness. Was the absence of sound the weapon of the assassins, or the shield of those who survived? Did silence destroy, or did it reveal what was already broken? Historians poring over fragments of scrolls and ruins of murals offered judgment in careful words that the silent night was less a single event and more a mirror. It reflected the empire as it truly was, divided, fragile, blind to its own decay. For the people, the judgment was simpler. They did not need scrolls or philosophy. To them, the silent night was proof that no throne is unshakable, no crown untouchable, no empire éternel. And perhaps that was the truest judgment of all, that silence had not only destroyed a court, but humbled an empire. The silent night stood, in the end, not as mystery, not as myth, not even as history, but as warning. Generations later, the silent night was no longer just a story. It became ritual. It became tradition. It became a wound remembered in ceremony. In some provinces, bells were silenced once a year at midnight, a single hour of stillness observed to honor the dead. Families gathered around dim candles, speaking no words, as if to share in the silence that had swallowed the empire so long ago. In the capital, rulers ordered festivals instead loud parades filled with drums and horns, an effort to drown out the memory with noise. They declared it a celebration of purity and survival, not of loss. Yet even as the streets thundered with sound, some felt the silence beneath it, like a ghost pressing against the noise. There were places where memory was forbidden entirely, villages where speaking of the silent night was a crime, temples where priests were ordered never to mention it. But memory has a way of surviving in secret. In hidden shrines, small offerings were left, a dagger laid upon stone, a torch extinguished in the dark, symbols of betrayal and silence that only the faithful understood. The empire could not decide how to remember. Some sought to honor, some to erase, others to transform. But in every ritual, whether loud or quiet, the truth remained. The silent night could not be forgotten. For silence, once it claims an empire, never leaves it untouched. Though centuries had passed, the empire never truly escaped the silent night. Its shadow lingered in ruins, in stories, in the very stones of the capital. Travelers who walked the old palace corridors swore they felt eyes upon them, though the halls were long abandoned. Guards posted at the gates claimed to hear faint footsteps at midnight, though no one walked there. Servants whispered of doors that creaked open on their own, of torches that sputtered suddenly, as if some unseen breath had passed them by. Legends grew around these hauntings. Some said the spirits of the slain nobles still wandered, seeking voices to finish the arguments cut short in their sleep. Others claimed the assassins themselves were cursed, doomed to walk the palace forever, replaying their betrayal in endless silence. A few believed that the silent night had stained the land itself, that even the soil beneath the palace walls had swallowed the echo of blood. But the ghosts were not only in the halls, they lived in the people. In every story told at a fireside, in every song sung in a whisper, in every lullaby warning children of shadows that come without sound, the ghosts endured. The empire changed, rulers rose and fell, banners were replaced, but the silent night remained, haunting not only the past, but the present. For ghosts are not only spirits of the dead, they are the memories a people cannot let go. And the silent night left ghosts, too many, too heavy, to ever be laid to rest. The silent night did not remain within the empire's borders. Its shadow spread outward, carried by merchants, wanderers, and refugees who fled in the years that followed. In distant lands, kings and rulers whispered of it with unease. They feared the same fate might one day strike their own courts. That silence, more than armies, could undo their crowns. Some tightened their guard, building higher walls and surrounding themselves with spies. Others sought to learn from the tragedy, crafting laws to keep power balanced, to prevent betrayal from festering in their own halls. Among the people of foreign lands, the story grew into legend. It was told as a cautionary tale by travelers in marketplaces, of a night when an empire, mighty and proud, was cut down not by war, but by silence. Parents in faraway kingdoms used it as warnings. Speak truth while you can, for silence can kill as surely as a blade. Artists in distant courts painted scenes of the event, though they had never seen the palace themselves. In some, assassins became demons cloaked in shadow. In others, the emperor was depicted as a tragic hero, betrayed by his closest friends. Each retelling shaped the legend anew, until the silent night belonged not to one empire, but to the world. It became more than history. It became a mirror. Every kingdom, every court, every crown feared it, for all could see themselves in its silence. The empire had fallen, but its shadow endured, etched not only in memory, but in the fears of nations yet unborn. The silent night began with whispers. It ended with silence, but its echo has never ceased. It was not just the fall of a court or the rise of new rulers. It was the moment an empire discovered that strength is fragile, that crowns are not iron, that silence can wound deeper than war. For the people, it became a warning passed in stories, in songs, in shadows. Beware the night when even the birds fall silent. For rulers, it became a fair and unspoken reminder that betrayal is always closest to the throne. For the world, it became a lesson that empires do not always fall with the roar of armies. Sometimes they fall with no sound at all. The silent night changed history, but more than that, it changed memory. It became myth, legend, warning, prophecy living on long after the empire itself had crumbled into dust. And so, even now, when torches flicker in long corridors, when silence falls too heavy at midnight, when shadows stretch across stone walls, people still remember. They lower their voices, they glance over their shoulders, for silence itself became a ghost that night, and its shadow has never left the world.